I am Sam Pitroda, member of the Mexican Walla Group. This is a group of dedicated, committed, experienced people from Mexico and Mexico lovers who meet once every Friday for about 60 minutes on a Zoom call to discuss issues that matter to Mexico and people of Mexico. We've been meeting for last 2 years. We as a group believe in democracy, human rights, freedom, justice, equality, love, role of community, technology, potential, especially for the future use of hyperconnectivity to democratize information, decentralize implementation, to demonetize services. And we also believe that Mexico has great deal of potential, lots of talent, good people, people who have done something interesting in life. But most of these people feel that Mexico could have done much better. If China, being so far away from US, can be the manufacturing capital of the world, if India, being so far away from US, could be software capital of the world, why can't Mexico benefit substantially from the proximity to the great power US and one of the largest market? These are some of the questions we have been asking as a group. We have discussed many subjects. We have discussed issues related to water, literacy, education, health, agriculture, employment. And we think in democracy, community must come forward with solutions, challenges, and speak up. We want people to join us in this journey together. As part of this process, we have started a legacy series. It is a series of conversations with prominent people from Mexico who have made significant contribution to Mexico's development. People who are perhaps at the tail end of their journey, and they have lots and lots of good things to share with all of us. Their journey in many ways is an example of what can be done in Mexico. They have struggled, succeeded, survived, contributed, and there are lessons for young people, and they provide us the hope for the future. Today, we are lucky to have Mr. Carlos Ross, a distinguished engineer, politician, social worker, sort of a person who has been through lots of different experiences in Mexico and outside Mexico. I met Carlos just about a couple of months ago. I was very impressed personally with his understanding of the challenges being faced not only by Mexico, but by the world. We were discussing a book that I have recently written on redesign the world. And Carlos had some very interesting insight. And I'm sure today we will all benefit from hearing him. Carlos, welcome to this series on legacy.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. It's an honor to be part of this. As you mentioned, we've only met a few months ago, and I think I've learned a lot from you. Obviously, first from your book, which I had the pleasure of reading, and then with our interactions, and I always learn to love from new friends. And thank you for having
me. No, thank you. You are very generous. I'm very impressed with all the books in your library. Well, I'm sure you have a lot of wisdom to share with us.
It's a mixture of a lot of things.
Good. So normally what I'd like to do is start with your journey, learn a little bit about your childhood, share with us about your education, your early life, profession, your dream for Mexico, Mexico of the past, Mexico of today, lessons you learned that you would like to share with young people. And I think it's going to be free-flowing conversation.
Okay.
There are no hard and fast rules. We'll just have a chat, nice friendly chat. You can stop me anytime and we can change things around. It should be as convenient as possible to you.
I'm sure I'll enjoy it.
So let's start with your childhood. I'm very interested in your childhood, your parents, your family, where you were brought up. What was Mexico like then? What was Mexico like then?
I'm son of immigrants. My parents came to Mexico from Europe, and my father, for the first time in the 20s, my mother then in the 30s. In fact, they met here in Monterrey, where I live now. They met here by my mother's brother and my father's father were neighbors, and that's how my parents met. So they crossed the world. In fact, they came.
Did she come from the same country in Europe?
My mother was German, and my father was Dutch, but also born in Germany. So he was raised in the German language, and so pretty much the German culture, German-Dutch culture.
Good.
And my father came to Mexico because my grandfather had come to build a zinc refinery in Saltillo, which is about 50 miles west here of Monterrey, in the 1920s.
Wow.
And as my grandfather finished after several years and went back, some Mexicans here in Monterrey told him, well, here in Monterrey, there's a lot of metallurgy, steel, lead, refineries. So why doesn't he stay here and become a consultant, which he did. My father worked first in some mines. My father loved, the first time he came as a teenager, he loved Mexico. He had just finished his equivalent of high school, and he wanted to stay. He came to visit his father. He wanted to stay, and said, my grandfather said, no, you go back, you study at the university, and when you're finished, you can do whatever you want, which is exactly what he did, because he wanted to come back. So he came back as a metallurgical engineer, worked in some mines, and for the Christmas holidays came to visit his father, and that's how he met my mother. My mother,
I assume they took boat.
Her brother had had.
I assume they took boat.
Yes, the trips were 6 to 8 weeks. So it wasn't a quick hop over the ocean. It was usually took months, maybe 6 months. You'd come over, visit, and go back. So my mother came to help her brother with his child. He had some newborn sickness or something. And my mother was a nurse, a children's nurse, so sort of a nanny nurse. And so she came, and that's how they met. And my mother went back to Germany to get her things, her dowry or whatever things she had. She came back to Mexico in 1938. Got off the boat. They married in Tampico, which is a port city on the Gulf. Off the boat, they got married, went on a honeymoon, and settled here in Monterrey. So I'm the youngest child of three brothers, and we were all born here in Monterrey. We all grew up in Monterrey. I guess when my parents came to Mexico, Monterrey was a city of maybe 200,000 inhabitants. In the 1930s, I guess very similar to many cities in North America. There wasn't that much of a difference maybe between cities in Texas and cities in northern Mexico. So in my lifetime, the city has grown by 20 times. It's now 5 million people. So that has changed. It definitely has changed.
It looks like Monterrey
And my
always has been.
childhood,
Go ahead.
well, my childhood was since my father worked. It was originally an American company, an American lead refining company. I went to school in what is called the American School, which is a school that is designed and defined as an American school, and it's affiliated with and accredited and certified by the American schools in the United States. And it was originally set up to have a school for the American children that came to Monterrey, because the companies, there were a lot of American companies here in Monterrey, as there still are. And up until the Second World War, there was also a German school. And had the war not come, obviously, I probably would have gone to the German school, but that was shut down. And so I got my American education. And because I got this American education, I could not study in a Mexican university. So I was.
Is that right? Why was that?
Study, because at the time in the American school had the American school program,
and they did not teach local language.
Yes, we had 1 hour of Spanish, 1 hour of Mexican history, things like that. But it was accredited for primary and secondary, or primary and middle school, but not for high school.
Wow.
When I was studying, after I finished studying, it was also accredited for high school, and then I wouldn't have had a problem studying in Monterrey Tech, for example. But I had to study. Either I had to take my high school program again, or I had to study in the United States. So I was accepted to study at the University of Texas in Austin. And so I went to the University of Texas. So that's sort of briefly my childhood.
But what you told us is that Monterrey was always a technology city. That's what I read in your comments, that metallurgy.
Yes. And I think there maybe it's, and that's why I came back to work here. Maybe that's a good point you have there. Let's say in the early part of the 20th century, Monterrey, before the beginning of the industrial part in Monterrey, Monterrey was a trading center. So you had the Gulf Coast, which is Brownsville, Texas, Tampico, Tamaulipas, that part. They would import merchandise from Europe. It would arrive in Monterrey, and Monterrey was sort of a trading post for all of northern Mexico. So you would ship to northern Mexico all the way to the west coast to Baja California.
And the borders with US were much transparent. The borders with US were much transparent.
I guess the borders with the U.S. It was much easier to cross. That's for sure. It was an easy flow. I remember. I think I was 7 years old, and I got my first. We called them border crossing cards. It was a little ID, a little card with my photograph in plastic, not very technological. And with that, I could cross the border. I could not enter into the United States, but I could visit all of the border of the United States. And that was enough. Maybe another story, my first visits to the border, because it became a tradition that we would go shopping in the border because they had better stores or better merchandise in the border towns of Texas than here in Monterrey. And my first trips to the border as a very young child, I guess in diapers still, was because my mother would, the whole family, we would go to the border, and my mother would prepare packages that she would send through the US to friends and relatives in Germany. Wow. Germany was destroyed at that time. And so little things like needles and thread, shoes, used garments, anything that could help friends and relatives in Germany. And so those were my first trips to the border. And then after that, it became sort of when Helen and I were married, we would go to the border also. I mean, it was
and how long
shopping.
It took then, how long it took then to get to the border?
Oh, it was a car drive. Probably in the late 40s, it was 4 or 5 hours. Now it's 2 hours to the border. So it was. Back then, you had to at least stay overnight. Later, we would just drive up in the morning and come back in the afternoon. So I think our culture here is very American, as you may have felt when you came to Monterrey. And I think we are affected by the American culture as much as Texas and the border states are affected by Mexican culture. You know, there's just a mix.
But did you have a chance to go to Mexico City then when you were young? Did you travel in Mexico?
It really was far away. You know? Mexico City, if you took the train, there were trains that you could go maybe overnight. If you drove, it was 10 to 12-hour drive. So it was, and I was going to say, we were closer to Texas, and Texas was closer to us than either of us were close to our national capital. So Texas was closer to us than it was to Washington. We were closer to Texas than we were to Mexico City. So there wasn't any unifying media like television. Television came then in the late 50s, early 60s. And here in Mexico, television really took off, color television took off in preparation of the Olympics. We had the
Yes.
Olympics in 1988.
Yes.
And so that was the first time we saw everything in color on television.
And what was Mexico like in your childhood?
Actually, we didn't anything south of Monterrey. We didn't travel much. If we wanted to go to the beach, we would go to the Texas beach because there they had hotels.
Mhm.
If we, well, outside of that, I think my first major travel was in 1955 when the whole family went to Europe to visit friends and relatives for the first time after the war.
Mhm.
So that was a 24-hour trip I remember on KLM DC-6 4-propeller plane from Monterrey all the way to Holland. But we outside I didn't get to know Mexico at all. I didn't get to know the southern part or the central part. Mexico City, we went a few times to visit friends, and it was the big city. It was it's always been, and I think once I remember very well where I was when President Kennedy was assassinated. I was in a taxi cab in Mexico City with my mother, and I had gone, since I grew tall very fast, my spinal cord was not complete. So it lacked calcium and things like that. So we went to a specialist in Mexico City. And we were in a taxi cab in the middle of Mexico City when we saw the headlines in a newspaper saying that he had been assassinated. But those were the very few occasions that I traveled to Mexico City. And vacationing, we very often went to the beach on the Texas Gulf Coast, and that was it.
And what did you study?
That was another decision, because my older brother studied chemical engineer because my only uncle was a chemist. The second oldest studied metallurgy because our father had studied metallurgical engineering, and so I was sort of pressed into becoming an engineer. But I really didn't have. At 18, I certainly didn't have an idea of what kind of an engineer. So when I went to study engineering at the University of Texas, you have 2 years of a common, sort of a common group of classes. So I didn't have to decide. And then when it came time to decide, I think I was more inclined to industrial engineering, but
which was a big thing then.
Didn't have.
Yeah.
Which was a big thing. Yeah. And so I studied mechanical engineering with a minor in industrial engineering. And I liked it so much that then I continued and I studied a master's degree in industrial engineering
Good.
before coming back to Mexico and going to work. And
could you find a job? Could you find a job in Mexico with that education?
In fact, after I got my mechanical engineering degree, I was interviewed like in the universities. They post for seniors interviews and things like that. And so I interviewed with some American companies. One of them was Procter and Gamble. They invited me to Mexico City for an interview for their Mexico City operations. I did not take the job because I decided to stay on for the master's degree. When I finished the master's degree, I had one of my friends that was also studying the master's degree, his brother was managing an IT department in one of the large companies here in Monterrey, Vitro, the glass group. And so he told me, why don't you come and join this new thing that's called IT? Because at that time there were no degrees, careers, anything focused on IT. So IT was formed by engineers or just programmers that were taken off the street, pretty much. You know? So and so I did that for 5 years. Another 5 years in the chemical group called CIDSA. So I was in IT, operations research, industrial engineering, that part of those corporations.
Mm-hmm.
And in those corporations, in the second company, CIDSA, I got together with another 2 friends in that company and one of their friends in another large corporation. And we decided to become independent and start our consulting firm.
Oh, so you became an entrepreneur.
And so that was that was in the early 80s. We started the consulting firm. I am right now the only owner of this consulting firm that I sort of had put to rest, put to sleep, because in the last 12 to 15 years, I was dedicated more to a project from the University of Texas, which was called the Center for Global Innovation and Entrepreneurship, where we taught researchers and entrepreneurs how to start a business. And so that's sort of been my professional.
Good. Now, can we talk a little bit about your wife? Where did you meet her and what does she do?
Well, my wife, we met. We lived here in Monterrey. We lived inside an industrial compound. So when American companies would come and set up their operations, inside the company walls,
they'll build the apartment and all.
Inside the company, they would build a small group of houses. So in ours, we had 9 houses, and so my childhood from birth through high school, we lived inside this facility of 9 houses, a swimming pool, that sort of thing. Helen's father worked for the same company in another city and was transferred to Monterrey, and so they lived in another house. We were in house number 1, and they were in house number 7. And there were we were maybe 10 kids, 15 kids total. And so everyone played with everyone. No, if we wanted to play softball, well, everybody came to play. All ages and all the families,
Sure.
and so it was just that's how we met.
Very close
And
community.
so a very close community, and we always say that when we were maybe in high school, um, when Helen wanted to go to a party or to an outing, maybe Helen's parents would say, "Well, is Carlos going?" And she said, "Yes, okay. Well, then he can take care of you." So I was sort of, uh,
Bodyguard.
I could, I guess. But,
Bodyguard.
but our relationship then obviously became serious. And while I was at the University of Texas, we became more serious. So when I came back from the University of Texas and studying, we married very young. Because Helen's family was moving away again, and so we married. We lived in my parents' house for 6 or 7 years while we built this house,
Sure.
and I've been living in the same house for 40 some years.
You remember any good teachers in your career that you benefited from? Any good teachers in your career that you benefited from?
Any what? Pardon?
Teachers.
Oh,
Any
teachers.
important teachers that you remember?
Yes, I remember several from school, from maybe middle school, high school. Mr. Jones, our music teacher and math teacher, that's where I learned how to play the flute, which I don't play anymore. Mr. McIntosh was a math and history teacher, and he impressed us because he was in the design of the Polaris missiles, the Polaris nuclear missiles and submarines. So we had interesting people in high school, and these were usually Americans that would come to teach a few years and go back. In the university, in fact, Dr. Lesso has been with me all my life almost. He passed away years ago, but he was my advisor and my master's thesis advisor. And he also became my godfather here in Mexico because I invited him to our wedding, and he signed our wedding document also. And so that automatically makes him and his wife godparents of us.
Good. Good.
I kept in touch with him a long time. He was a professor in operations research. And so there's been those that have affected me. I think those that most affected me obviously were my uncle and my father. They've always been sort of a model of a moral compass, no? How they acted, how they were, just was the best example I could have, and so. My uncle was an example. He was also German honorary consul, and so when I became honorary consul in Germany,
tell us about that. Tell us about your experience as honorary consul. Tell us about your experience.
Well, this was, I guess I was in my 40s, so still pretty young and still pretty focused on work. But I mentioned that we had formed a consulting firm, 4 of us. And the oldest, Ted Lawrence, was at the time the British honorary consul. So I could see from his activities what it was like to be honorary consul. And my uncle had been, there was another gentleman that was German honorary consul. He was going to retire. And so he would select a few people from the German community to propose to the German embassy his replacement. And I don't know how they selected, but I guess they selected me. And so I became German honorary consul. It was this, and it was exactly at the time when the two Germanys reunited. So I became German honorary consul in 1990. And so that was a time, and I saw the volume of, and I think that's what I'm most proud of is the volume of students going to study to Germany. I think in 1990 or 1991 we had like 6 visas, student visas. And a few years ago, we had 600. Well, maybe 400. Total of 600 visas. 400 were students. So there was a larger number of locals going to study, and I think that's what I'm most proud of, that we could promote that.
Good, good. Maybe we can just shift a little bit to Mexico,
Yes.
the nation. What do you think? Where Mexico is today, what are the challenges you see based on your
challenges you see,
and what advice would you have for the young people?
based on your, and what advice would you have for the young people?
It's certainly different. When I was young, maybe starting jobs, it was sort of understood that if I got a job for one of the main corporations here in Monterrey, and there were maybe 5 or 6 of them, it was a job for life.
Mm-hmm.
And you could see that with the previous generation, and the companies took care of you. There was company house for the workers, maybe not for the professionals as much, but for the workers. They had housing, low-cost housing, low-cost healthcare, before decades before the federal government started Social Security programs and housing programs at a national level. Monterrey was always in the forefront. So the Monterrey business people did that. They had their own housing programs and their own clinics and healthcare facilities. And so when I came back from studying, it was more or less understood, expected. My life was going to be in one of these companies. But I think my generation then started to change that. It was strange for many people for me to move from one corporation to another. And these were just the same, they were the same families. The owners were the same families, but different corporations. But it was not seen well, to betray one company and go to another. And then when 5 years later, we decided to get together with my friends to do consulting, it was, my parents were shocked. My parents were worried that I wasn't going to be working in a company and that I would be. But I had one example, one model that I followed, which was my uncle. He was a chemist, and he built his own company because he came working for a company. During the war, he was left without a job because he was German. and so he started tinkering at home with chemicals, and built a company that later became part of a multinational concern in flavors and aromas and things like that. He was my sort of example. He was my excuse.
Yeah.
I think more. I would say, well, if my uncle could do it, maybe I can do it too. Because both of my brothers worked all of their lives for my oldest brother for 2 companies, my other brother for 1 company all of his life. So it was, I guess I was a little bit different, or not a rebel, but I think I was a little bit different, than my siblings. And so it was hard. Consulting was not something that was normal, but we went IT consulting, which was something that we could, I think, work at. In the meantime, I had the backing of Helen because she continued to work. So in the bad times of consulting, we had the minimum income, things like that. So those were hard. And the 1980s, Mexico had a very stable economy. Let's say the 50s, the 60s. 60s were a good growth period, and say the early 70s. 1976, we have our first devaluation against the American dollar, which was a shock. We had a very stable currency.
What was it then?
We
How
were
much?
building our
How many?
house.
What was the stability then?
How much
Was dollar
It was,
worth?
12 pesos and 50 cents to a dollar. And it went up. In 76, I think it went up from 12.50 to 18. So it was like a 50% increase in the dollar. I remember we here in Mexico, we build with concrete blocks, our houses. The first concrete block I bought to build my house cost me 1 peso. The last one cost me 4.
Wow.
So, it was also a struggle just to semi-finish the house, to make it livable, things like that. It was, I think in the late 70s is when the instability began. And we've had instability, we've had major economic instabilities just about at the end of each presidential term. The president holds it together until at the end it just falls apart. And the last major one was 1994. So between the mid 70s and the mid 90s, it was a roller coaster. We had, I think, 1 year we had 180% inflation. Because the government controlled the central bank, there was no independent central bank. So I think Mexico slowly began to learn what it needed to do, by making all these mistakes. We learned we needed an independent central bank. We needed foreign currency reserves. We needed to connect with the rest of the world. In the 1980s, we could not purchase anything outside of Mexico legally. So, as I told you a while ago, that we would go to the border shopping. When we came back, we had to sort of, if we bought electronics or things like that, a telephone for the house, that was the electronic part at the time. We would have to hide it maybe inside the car. It became customary to pay the border, the customs people pay them a bribe, and they wouldn't check your car. And it was the norm. It was custom, and everyone did it on both sides. No, it was understood that that's the way you can do business between individual citizens. This was not companies. You know? And so in the 1980s, we were pretty closed off from the rest of the world. Most or all of the products in, say, a supermarket were Mexican made. All of the automobiles were assembled in Mexico. They were forced to be, and that's how the Mexican automobile industry started, because the Mexican government said by decree the Mexican auto industry would be integrated in a certain form so that there was more local content. So all of these things happened, say, from the mid-late 70s up until the 80s. And then we had a president that started working on this free trade agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And that really changed Mexico. It brought it into the rest of the world. And then we, I think from free trade agreement, the first one I think started in '94. And then we just went wild. We wanted to have free trade agreements with everyone after that. You know? Free trade agreement with Europe, with Asia, with individual countries. I don't know how many we have, but we have a lot. So that's what we lived in, first in total economic isolation, and then the opening up of the economy with the free trade agreement, and that brought pain and opportunity. You know, opportunity to export, opportunity to and pain for the companies that couldn't keep up. That having a closed economy also causes very much inefficiency, low quality, right, because you don't have a choice. Yeah. It's sort of like an internal monopoly. And once we opened up, and as a consultant, then I also started working with some companies. For example, one company for about a year and a half, I helped integrate this Mexican company bought smaller companies in the US. They were in the ladders and windows and things like that, production. And so they bought smaller companies in Tennessee and Arkansas and integrated them into their production chain and used them as warehouses to ship and things like that. So since I had an American culture, I went to the U.S. operations to help integrate their culture into the Mexican business culture, and so that was a switch. Usually, it was American or foreign companies coming to Mexico and bringing their culture, and this was a Mexican company going to the U.S. and taking their culture, which was more sophisticated because these were small companies that were family run or things like that. And so you bring in this whole new business culture, and they didn't accept it very well from people who didn't look like them, and that was another one of my jobs.
Now you are working on innovation. How do you see innovation in Mexico?
Do you see innovation?
Well, that's yeah. I guess I for the last 20 years. We've been first. I worked on developing certain communities to develop their technology, and this was, for example, blue jeans manufacturing, furniture manufacturing. These were not high tech, but we had to introduce technology into these companies. And for example, blue jeans is a good example. we had in a region here in Mexico, we produced 40% of the American blue jean consumption, which was 6 million jeans per week
Wow.
were shipped to the U.S.
Uh-huh.
And what we did was say what you need is a innovation center, and the innovation center can be innovation in gene design, in gene manufacturing process, in logistics. And we brought together, because there were a lot of smaller, there were maybe 4 large producers and then maybe 50 smaller producers, and trying to bring them together to work as one and things like that. And so we used government funding to help them get going. The same thing we tried in the Yucatan Peninsula with furniture manufacturing, but and even before that, we got a project. This was in the late 1980s, to bring innovation to small and medium-sized companies here in northern Mexico. I think we did it for like 30 companies. And it was just sort of make them aware. Usually the owners, because these were smaller companies, make them aware of what innovation can do for them. And then if they defined a project, an innovation project, we would steer them to the National Council of Science and Technology for funding. And they would get funding to develop these projects. And those were my beginnings in innovation. And after that were clusters, like the genes cluster, developing innovation in genes clusters. And then came this big program here in Monterrey called Monterrey City of Knowledge. That started in about 2004, something like that, with the governor, 2004, 2006 maybe. And this was a major transformation of the state of Nuevo León. State of Nuevo León was always a manufacturing area, and we became very good at, and still are, in producing, very efficient. But this governor had a longer vision, and in fact, his doctoral thesis in a French university had been about making Nuevo León a high-tech region. And when he became governor, that's exactly what he did. And one of the physical manifestations of this was the technology park near the airport. And so they started bringing in facilities to this technology park. There's right now, I think there's like 35 different centers, from the private sector, the public sector, private universities, and government research centers. And I was involved then with the University of Texas to set up this Center for Global Innovation and Entrepreneurship. But it was much more than that. I think the whole state became a community. And so we built this community in different ways, federal funding, just networking here between universities and the private sector. It was, I think, from 2010 to 2020, that was my period in the game. I think we really did a lot. We're able to do a lot to bring a new mindset into the state. And this was all a vision of one governor who Fortunately, the following governors sort of went along with it, because usually you get a different governor and a different priority and things like that. But it was enough, it gained enough momentum to be self-sustaining. And places like Monterey Tech focused on innovation, entrepreneurship, and so that kept things moving.
Now I have 4 specific questions I want to ask, if you don't mind. First, what are the lessons you learned in your journey that you think are very important?
I think several. I'll start with the first one that comes to mind. Don't plan ahead too much, because you're going to end up somewhere else. I studied mechanical engineering. I never practiced it. I went into IT. From that, I went into innovation. From that, I've thought about more global things. So don't plan ahead too much. Don't think that you know where you're going. Much more important to me is feel the environment around you. Guide yourself by what's going on, what other people are doing, what other people are telling you, other examples, other opportunities. This, for example, this University of Texas project that I did for 10 years was because because I was, well, it's a long story, but I'll tell you some other day. But because I accidentally bumped into someone in an event that took me on this path that I never would have thought that I was going to do.
I agree with you that life is full of accidents.
Yeah, and keep your eyes open to these accidents, no, and certainly be discriminate. You don't have to take them all. You can measure what it'll do for you and what you can do for the project. The other thing is, and I think that goes for everyone, the first part of your life the very first part of your life is discovery until you start working professional. The next part is sort of building something, building a family, building a home, building whatever. And the last part is just, for me, it is figuring out what all this means. I look back on what all this means and then look forward and say, well, not only now, I think giving back is something you do during your life, but you have to be more careful at the end of your life to make sure you give back enough. And that's what you have to do. You have to look for opportunities to give back, to help other people, and that gives you much more pleasure than in your earlier life working and making something, building something.
Thank you. But what about lessons for the young people in Mexico? What lessons or what advice would you give to young people in Mexico today?
Well, that's a hard one, a much harder one, because it depends on how I feel the day you ask me what our future is for Mexico. We don't have any children, but we have a lot of nephews. And so I focus on nephews and next generation. It's tough. And I guess one thing that I learned is that we're much more resilient than we think. We've had some very bad times in Mexico in the 80s, economically, politically, etc. We seem to be going through the same period now. And so for the young people of Mexico, I say, go for the long run. This will pass, and be prepared and see what you can do to say minimize the damage and take advantage of future opportunities, because it really is it's difficult for young people, and unfortunately many young people, many of the most talented young people leave Mexico every year. Just our friend Ricardo Canales, his daughter, she just graduated. She's going to the US, Facebook, I think. But we don't have the opportunities. So how do we, and it's the job of the older generation to create the opportunities for the younger generation. So that's a challenge. There are many opportunities, I think, for younger generation. And I see one of my hopes for the younger generation that I see is that they are more engaged. They understand Mexico better than I understood Mexico when I was their age, and that gives me hope. They understand the complexity, and I see it in nephews and children of friends of ours. They understand it and they love it and they're engaged. So it's a different Mexico.
So there is a hope.
Oh yes. Because I see this resilience and the resilience, much of the resilience, for example, much of the resilience is in family. I think we still have very strong family ties in Mexico. And so when something goes bad, the family sort of pulls together and works it out. You know? Many families then live together and things like that. So it's we work through it. I think that's part of our heritage and culture. We can manage. We're resilient, and that also brings a negative side. We're complacent, and so I would tell the younger generation, don't be as complacent as we were. Demand from your employers, your politicians, to do the right thing, to get things done, to improve I think our focus really needs to be on improving those who have very little, improving their lives. And so sometimes I see some of the younger generation going into nonprofits and things like that, which sort of lifts my spirits a little. But I think complex country, as all are, but I think we're very resilient in that sense.
Good. What advice would you have for the Mexican politicians and government?
Oh boy. Think of your constituents. Unfortunately, too many Mexican politicians are in the business of politics for themselves and for their colleagues and for their politician community. They're sometimes professional politicians instead of representatives of community. So obviously, it's think of who you represent and think of the long term. And there are good ones. Hopefully, they will prevail.
But what about for the government? What advice for the government? liberalize more?
I think we need to do both things. I think if we go back to say before this, the current administration, we were a very well, like from the 1980s to 2016, we became a very open country, not only economy, but very open society. I think we learned a lot from there. We began building independent institutions, say independent government institutions, and that was good. They have been weakened, and we have tested them, and I think we're having trouble with some of them. So we need to strengthen those institutions. We definitely need to be more inclusive and equal. We are a very, our Gini is very low, I think, no, very high, which means that we have a very large mass of very poor people, and we need to develop that part. Obviously, the way to do it is a liberal model of jobs and work, and that is very hard to do when our educational system is not moving them in that direction. So if there's anything that needs to be fixed, it's our education, from primary education on up. And that is going to be that's the major challenge for the future of Mexico. How do we educate our kids?
Thank you. I think I agree with you at a personal level. I see some similarities with India and many other developing countries. And I firmly believe in democracy, human rights, free market. And like you said, institutions need to be independent. Institutions need to be independent, autonomous, and free to do their job. We also need civil society.
Exactly.
You know, we need a very strong civil society that worries about the community, larger issues like environment, water, sanitation, energy, education, health. Governments cannot deliver on many of these things unless you have local civil society.
Yes.
Third, we need faith in technology. You know, technology has changed everything in this world. And how are we going to use technology? You know, technology has changed everything in this world. And how are we going to use technology?
Yeah, in civil society, I have seen an intellectual growth, but in a strange way, maybe better than in other countries, in the sense that there's more local demands. I think if you see, and I'm thinking of the immigrants to Monterrey. Monterrey grew out of immigrants from other states of Mexico. They came for a better life. They came to work, and so they worry about the education of their children, a good education, things like that. So that part of civil society, I think, is good. I think the political aspect has not grown as much. So we don't, we don't call to accountability our leaders and politicians. I think that needs to change. And it's education. I remember my education in the American school. We had a civics class, but a Mexican civics class. So, because it was required by the government to teach civics in the schools, that's gone. So we've lost some of that, which we need to regain.
Good. Then the point you made on inclusion is the key. We got to build inclusive society. We got to build inclusive society. Everywhere. Very few people are very rich. Everywhere. And lots of people are very rich.
Yeah.
And Mexico is no exception.
That was part of my studying in my sabbatical year of COVID, the inclusion part, and it has to start in the communities and then grow into.
It has to start at home. It has to start at home.
It has to start at home.
It has to start at home.
It has to start at home. Yeah.
Now, last question,
and
maybe then we can summarize. Last question.
Yeah.
What would be your advice to Mexico Wala group? Are we doing the right things? Should we be doing something different?
I think I saw a dilemma in yesterday's meeting, which was the largest that I've seen, and it's how much do we do privately without publicity? Because I think in yesterday's discussion there was a group that said no, let's keep it low key and let's work, try and work through the government and the institutions. And the other one is let's go to the press, let's go to the media, let's make some noise. No? And that is a very difficult balance. I've seen it in different cases, and ideally you do both. You do it intelligently, because I know Mexico Vuela for a couple of months, and it's still a very private group that does not like other people to know about it, just about. No? And I've experienced that in other organizations.
I think we need to change that, you know?
Yeah, I think in the short term, it's good, but in the long term, it's terrible. Okay?
Exactly. I agree. I agree.
Because I saw that with the University of Texas involvement here in Mexico. They kept it low key and it disappeared. So you have to somehow, and make sure that you're not exaggerating and things like that. But the thing is, it's a very political it's an organization that deals with very political issues. And when that is the case, it's very difficult to balance.
I agree, but I still believe that in information age, we got to be open, transparent, accessible. We have to network. And these are all the requirements for the future.
Yeah.
We cannot keep quiet. And, you know, if somebody doesn't like it, we can have a conversation. If somebody doesn't like it, you know, we are open.
Yeah.
Okay. You know, we are open.
Yeah, I agree. Be open, but not confrontational. I think if we follow those rules,
there is no need for confrontation.
No,
We got to agree to
overall-
disagree.
There's no need for confrontation.
Well,
Yeah.
in a closing remark, I want to thank you, Carlos Ross, for a great conversation. You indeed have a fascinating journey coming from immigrant family, going to school in Monterey, going to college in Texas, living your life in Mexico as an engineer, innovator, one who is concerned about Mexico, and one who has a lot of lessons to share.
And one who has a lot of lessons to share.
So I really appreciate your spending time with us. I want
I
others,
really appreciate your spending time
especially
with
young
us.
people, to listen to you carefully, learn from you, use you as an example of the community leader, someone who has wisdom to share. And I want to invite many more people to come join us during our Friday conversations at Mexico Wala. I'm sure you will add value, learn, and build a community. We know Mexico has a lot more potential. We know Mexico can do a lot better. But it can only happen if each one of us take this seriously, work hard, collaborate, cooperate, and co-create together, and use the technology today that we have to change the nature of Mexico, opportunities in Mexico, with focus on people at the bottom of the economic pyramid. Thank you, and wish you all the best.
Thank you, Sam. It's been a wonderful conversation. I think much more for me than you, because I remember, I go back in my memories and remember things, but I really appreciate this conversation and hope to continue contributing and finding others that want to contribute to this.
Great. No, I just wish we had a little better connection, but that's all right. We'll just make best out of what we got. Great. Thanks, Carlos. Thank you very much.